Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel, the Corcoran Codex. What I want to discuss in this screencast are a group of banks known as G SIBs, which stands for Global Systemically Important Banks. Sometimes these are known as the too big to fail banks. And basically, these are banks that have been classified or designated by regulators as being of such size and systemic importance that they need to hold additional capital and are subject to even more stringent regulations. To really set the context for this discussion, it's useful to go back to the '08 crisis and remind ourselves of some of the more damaging and distressing occurrences within that period, where many large banks had major difficulties. Several failed, some had to be rescued, such as the Royal Bank of Scotland in the UK. Others were left to fail, such as Lehman Brothers. And the idea was that the world's politicians believed that there was a need to deal with the so-called too big to fail issue. At the G20 summit in Pittsburgh in 2009, political leaders called on the Basel-based Financial Stability Board to propose measures to address the systemic and moral hazard risks associated with what at the time were called systemically important financial institutions, or SIFIs. The too big to fail problem arises when the threatened failure of a SIFI leaves public authorities really with no option but to bail it out, using public funds to avoid financial instability and damage to the global economy. Example would be the rescue of Royal Bank of Scotland here in the United Kingdom. The idea is that the safety net idea encourages something known as moral hazard, which may in turn mean that the key management executives at a SIFI may, believing that there will be a rescue attempt, they may take excessive risks. Bailouts obviously represent a large implicit public subsidy of private enterprise. As I said, the G20 asked the FSB, this body based in Basel, Switzerland, to prepare a set of proposals to deal with the too big to fail problem. And this actually is the document that was eventually produced. And you can see it talks in terms of the adequacy of loss absorbing capacity of global systemically important banks. When the Financial Stability Board eventually reported and made their recommendations to the G20, they declared their intention to end the too big to fail issue. They said that their objective was to ensure the adequacy of global systemically important financial institutions' loss absorbing capacity without the use of public funds. And the FSB called this capacity TLAC, standing for Total Loss Absorbing Capacity. Interestingly, not capital, although to be honest, the terms are fairly similar. So the FSB set out to define a minimum standard for this capacity, and when they defined the type of capital that would be involved in providing this loss-absorbing capacity, it turned out to be what's known as bail-inable capital. In other words, the investors that put up the capital were told when they bought the bonds essentially that they would be included or bailed in if one of these very large institutions went into resolution. The capital would be written down or converted to equity if a bank was to enter a stage of non-viability and thereby needed to be resolved by the various authorities that we'll come on and talk about. During the G20 summit in Australia in 2014, the FSB presented the draft proposal, the cover of which we saw on the previous slide. So what the basic principles involved were as I say, sufficient loss absorbing and recapitalization capacity, and this should be available to implement an orderly resolution that would thereby minimize the impact on financial stability, ensure the continuity of critical functions, and avoid exposing public funds to loss through a bailout. The authorities should determine a firm-specific minimum TLAC requirement for each G SIB, and each G SIB thereby should maintain this minimum TLAC requirement. In some ways then, to summarize, similar to the points being made on the previous slide, the objectives of the FSB proposal were to reduce the probability of failure by increasing their going concern loss absorbency, reduce the extent or impact of failure by improving global recovery and resolution frameworks, and also for the G SIBs to have sufficient additional loss absorbing capacity to control for moral hazard due to the too big to fail issue. The classification system that was proposed by the FSB to determine, in effect, which of the world's large banks qualified for this particular designation of being a G SIB was based on a series of tests and scoring. And the scoring looked at the size of the banks, their interconnectedness, the lack of substitutes for their services, their global cross-jurisdictional activity, and their complexity. So let me then say a few things about these various tests. You can see here there were in fact these 5 different categories, and in total each category had a maximum score of 20%. In this case it was rather a simple 20%, and the size of the bank was based on the exposure amount as defined in the Basel III leverage ratio. This essentially relates to the gross value of a bank's balance sheet. Assets against liabilities, you take the gross values, you do not use the risk weighting approach, which is also used as part of the Basel framework. You can see various items here connected with interconnectedness. Each of these then was a third of the 20%. Substitutability looked at assets under custody, values of underwritten transactions in debt and equity markets. And with regard to complexity, the test related to the notional value of all OTC derivative exposures, a separate heading for level 3 assets. Level 3 assets refers to a type of instrument, asset held by a bank, let's say, like a derivative, where it is not possible to mark to market, either directly or indirectly, and one has to use what's known as the mark to model approach. So there we can see the various tests. And then based on applying those tests on an annual basis, a list of G SIB banks then is determined. We can see on the screen now that the most recent list was put together by the FSB towards the end of 2024 in November. A new list will obviously be made towards the end of November 25. And you can see over here the current list of the G SIB banks. There are 29 of them currently. This column here, which is entitled Bucket, relates to the amount of additional Tier 1 capital. This is in addition to the TLAC that these large banks must have, and it's based on the scoring system. So we can see that the bank which achieves the top score as of this date was JPM, and that bank thereby has to hold another 2.5% of Tier 1 capital in addition to all the other determined using the Basel III framework. In bucket 3 we have Citigroup and HSBC. I'm not going to read them all out. We have several banks here in this bucket here, including some of the big Chinese banks, the Agricultural Bank of China, China Construction Bank. And down at the under this bucket, we can see a number of other banks. You can see, for example, ING, Morgan Stanley, Royal Bank of Canada, Wells Fargo, and so on. The list does change. At one point, the list had 30 banks on it. One of those dropped out. I can mention one bank. I'm not sure it was, no, this was some time ago. RBS, rather, Royal Bank of Scotland, was actually on this list at one point, but it, I think, failed then, based on the scoring system, to be determined to be a G SIB. This was back in around 2017, if I recall. Over here, we can see some more description of the TLAC issue, which I've already basically mentioned. Now, the European Banking Authority puts together a report on how banks in the European markets performed with regard to those tests that I mentioned. So I'm just literally going to give you a sampling of what the most recent report showed. We can see here, for example, in terms of the OTC total exposures, and this would then be based on billions of euros. You can see Bank Paribas here, Crédit Agricole, you can see Deutsche Bank, and we can see, for example, Santander. Now, in terms of the complexity issue that we discussed a moment ago, you can see that, say, for example, the level 3 assets here, these would be those mark-to-model derivatives that I spoke about a moment ago. And we need to read those on the left scale, and we can see the OTC derivatives over here on the right scale. Now, this would be in trillions of euros. Over here, we can see, for example, Deutsche Bank had approximately 30 plus trillion in OTC derivative exposure, 30 plus more, actually, more like 40 trillion. And we can see, for example, that their level 3 assets, we read that over here on the left scale, would have been around 22, 23 billion, which is quite considerable. We can see, for example, BNP Paribas here with a higher exposure to the level 3 assets, as indeed would be Crédit Agricole and so on. So let me just summarize some of the highlights then of the TLAC proposals. The TLAC standard requires the G SIBs to have financial instruments available during resolution to absorb losses and enable them to be recapitalized to continue performing critical functions while a resolution process is ongoing. And the objective is to have an orderly resolution by making debt/equity holders, this would be the bail-inable debt, essentially, that I talked about. When people invest in this type of TLAC, they know that they could then be bailed in the case of a resolution. And this would thereby minimize the amount of public funds that would need to be used in a resolution. In other words, it would reduce the size of bailouts. The TLAC requirement is applied to the resolution entity based on a resolution plan that needs to be agreed by the bank itself, the G SIB, and its home and key host authorities. So, for example, if we take HSBC being extremely active throughout the world, its home jurisdiction is in the United Kingdom, but obviously has a very big presence in many other parts of the world, specifically Asia, then the plan would need to be agreed by both, say, the UK authorities and authorities, say, in Asia and elsewhere. So G SIBs that follow a single point of entry, for example, Royal Bank of Scotland was such a bank when it was a G SIB, will only have one resolution entity. G SIBs that follow a multiple point of entry resolution strategy, HSBC would be a good example, will have multiple resolution entities. And a resolution entity and its subsidiaries are collectively called a resolution group. A resolution entity's TLAC will be based on the consolidated balance sheet of the resolution group. And there may be material subgroups located outside the jurisdiction of the actual resolution entity. The point on this slide, which I am not going to cover in great detail, is that the idea is that for a G SIB, where there are multiple points of entry, the idea is to have arrangements in place where what's called internal TLAC is pre-positioned. It's available essentially to the various authorities that would be dealing with the resolution process in the appropriate territories. So the TLAC requirements can be met by instruments eligible for minimum regulatory capital requirements plus debt liabilities meeting certain criteria. This is the type of debt that I have called bail-inable debt. TLAC eligible liabilities should be subordinated to excluded liabilities such as deposits and structured products. So in other words, the depositors would need to be covered before the owners of this type of bail-inable debt would actually be paid out. And you can see the TLAC requirement shows down here. So you have these instruments divided by a risk-weighted approach to calculating the exposure of a bank. That would need to be greater than or equal to X. And then you have the same instruments. This time you divide by the leverage exposure measure. This has to do with the gross value of the assets. You do not apply the risk weighting that's applied here. Must be greater than Y. And then you can see here that the X and Y are said to be 16% and 6%. That's already phased out. But in the more under the more recent requirements, these two amounts must be 18% and 6.75%. The final slide has to do with some of the implications of the G SIB framework and the TLAC. Added funding costs of TLAC will lead to a reduction of the implicit public subsidy. Mentioned this already because there is this kind of bail-inable capital. G SIBs may pass on part of this higher funding cost to their clients. They may also become more efficient in pricing their services in order to be able to properly do a proper cost-benefit analysis of the fact that they have to hold this additional TLAC. TLAC holders will have greater incentives to discipline G SIBs, quite an important point really. And maybe then to finalize, let's just look at the maybe the sub-agenda really of the FSB when it was working on the proposals. Since there is no global authority with the power to require too big to fail banks to shrink or downsize, the imposition of the TLAC requirement and its impact on the return on equity for the G SIB banks might go on to achieve really perhaps what the FSB was hoping for, was that some of these G SIB banks will in fact decide to downsize. And there is some evidence that that has happened. For example, Barclays decided to shrink its business by, for example, abandoning its efforts to become a major bank in Africa. Deutsche Bank did a similar exercise by basically abandoning its efforts to become a major player in the Russian market. So I hope very much that you found that video to be of interest, and could I encourage you then to subscribe to my channel, the Corcoran Codex, where I will be adding similar material. And you can see the general theme of this YouTube channel is analysing critical ideas and episodes in the world of finance. Thank you very much for watching.